The morning the seamstress came to fit her for gowns she had not asked for, Edith stood very still in the long gallery of Wenmore Hall and let 3 women circle her with pins and measuring tapes, and she understood that she had become an object to be furnished. Outside the tall windows, the November sky hung the color of pewter over the bare elms. Inside, the fire snapped. The candles burned at midday because the light was poor, and a footman set down a tray of pale silks the Duke had ordered sent from London without consulting her. She was the second wife of the Duke of Wenmore. She had been his daughter's governess 11 months ago, and the whole county knew it, and the whole county had a word for what she was. Now a voice carried from the doorway, low and amused, meant to be heard. "The little governess in her borrowed plumage," it said. "He dresses her like a doll and calls it devotion." Edith did not turn her head. She had learned in service the art of becoming furniture, of letting a remark pass over her, as though she had not the wit to catch it. Her hand, resting against the gallery rail, pressed down until the knuckles whitened, and a warmth she despised climbed into her face, and she hated that her body answered the cruelty before her composure could refuse it. The seamstress murmured an apology she had no cause to make. Somewhere down the gallery, a clock struck the half-hour. And in the study at the far end of the corridor, behind a door that was nearly closed, a man she had married for reasons neither of them had spoken aloud, stood with his back to the room and a folded paper in his hand that he had not yet found the courage to open. If you find yourself drawn to her already, stay close, because what the world decided about Edith Lowell was not the truth of her, and the truth was about to begin its slow work. She had come to Wenmore Hall in the spring of the previous year, hired to teach a silent 6-year-old girl her letters and her music. The child was named Beatrice, and Beatrice had not spoken a full sentence since her mother died. The household spoke of the late Duchess in hushed, reverent tones, the way one speaks of a saint or a wound, and they spoke of the master in tones more careful still. The Duke of Wenmore was 36 years old, a tall man with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that seemed carved rather than born, and grief had set into him like frost into stone. He did not weep. He did not rage. He arranged his estate and his accounts and his correspondence with a cold exactitude, and he visited his daughter's schoolroom once a week and stood in the doorway and asked after her progress as though she were a tenant farm whose yields concerned him. Edith had not expected to be noticed. She was 24 plain, by the county's reckoning, with brown hair she pinned without ornament and gowns of serviceable gray, and she had buried her own father, a clergyman, 2 years before, and had nothing in the world but the small competence of her education and the determination to use it well. She taught Beatrice gently. She did not force the child to speak. She read aloud to her in the long afternoons, and she let the silence between them be a place to rest, rather than a thing to be cured, and slowly, over the months, the child began to answer her in single words, then in whole sentences, then in the easy chatter of a girl who has remembered she is alive. It was the reading aloud that the Duke first witnessed, though Edith did not know he had seen it. One evening in October, walking the corridor past the schoolroom, he stopped at the half-open door. Inside, Edith sat with Beatrice tucked against her side. She was reading a story of a lost child who finds her way home, and her voice did the work that grief had frozen in the house, and the child was laughing. He stood there a long time. He did not enter. He watched his daughter's face do the thing he had not been able to make it do in a year, and something in his own face moved, the smallest fracture, gone before anyone could have named it. Then he went on down the corridor, and he said nothing, and Edith, turning the page, never knew that the master of the house had paused at the door and been undone. The proposal, when it came that next winter, was not a romance. He sent for her to his study and told her plainly that his daughter needed a mother more than the law needed his bachelorhood preserved, that the household required a mistress, that he would not insult her with pretenses of sentiment, that he offered her his name, his protection, and a secure position for the rest of her life. He spoke the way a man reads the terms of a lease. Edith sat with her hands folded and her heart hammering in a way she would not show him, and she heard the loneliness underneath the cold recitation, the way one hears water moving under ice, and she said yes, and she told herself it was prudence. She told herself she had nowhere else to go, which was true. She did not tell herself that she had watched him stand at his daughter's door because she had not seen him do it. They married quietly in the parish church in February. There was no season for it, no breakfast for 200, only a vicar and 2 witnesses, and Beatrice in a new blue coat clutching Edith's gloved hand. And from the day she became the Duchess of Wenmore, Edith learned that the world had decided what she was, and would not be moved. The household's chief authority on the subject was the Duke's mother, the Dowager, who arrived from her own estate within the month, and installed herself in the best guest apartments, and undertook the project of teaching the county how to regard her son's regrettable choice. The Dowager was a handsome woman of 60, with white hair dressed high, and a fan she held always a half-inch above where another woman would have held it, and she had loved her first daughter-in-law, the late Cassandra, with the fierce, uncomplicated devotion that some women reserve for the daughters they wish they had borne. To the Dowager, Edith was a usurpation. She was the proof that Cassandra could be replaced, and that was a thing the Dowager would not forgive. And so she set about, with great courtesy and unwavering resolve, the work of reminding everyone that the governess was a governess still. "My son has always been generous to his dependents," the Dowager said at a dinner in March to a baroness seated at her right, with Edith 4 places down and well within hearing. One must only take care that generosity is not mistaken for elevation. The table heard it. A fork paused against porcelain. The baroness inclined her head with the small pleasure of someone handed a thing to repeat. And Edith, who had set down her glass at the first word, felt the old heat climb her throat and kept her eyes on the candle flame, and did not let her hand shake, though it wanted to. Across the table the Duke had gone very still. He set down his knife, he looked at his mother for the length of 3 breaths, and the look was not warm, and then he turned to Edith and said, in a voice pitched low but perfectly level, "You are not eating. The pheasant is good. Eat something." It was a command. The Dowager's mouth tightened at the rudeness of it, the way he had cut across her line as though it were nothing, as though his wife's plate mattered, more than his mother's wit. Edith heard only the command. She ate because she had been told to, and because it gave her something to do with her hands. And she did not understand until much later that he had been throwing his own body between her and the blade. She did not understand it because her wound would not let her. The wound was old and simple, and it had been delivered to her in 100 small ways across her life. She was the girl who was useful. She was the one who was kept on for what she could do, never chosen for what she was. Her own father had loved her, in the distracted way of a man who needed his sermons copied, and the family she had served before Wenmore had valued her for her steady hand with difficult children, and had never once thought of her as a woman a man might want. She had married a man who told her plainly that he did not love her, and she had believed him, and she had built her peace on the believing. So when the Duke set his pheasant before her like a shield, she filed it under duty. He was a fair man, protecting, a dependent. That was all. That was safe to think. What she could not file away so easily was her own body, which had begun, without her permission, to know where he was in any room. She would be at the far end of the long gallery teaching Beatrice a country dance, and the door would open, and she would know, before she turned, that it was him, by some change in the air, some quickening at the back of her neck. He took to dining at home more often than a widowed duke had any cause to. He took to walking in the gardens at the hour he knew she walked there with the child. He asked her opinion on matters of the estate that did not require it. The planting of the south field, the schooling of the tenants' children, and he listened to her answers with a still attention that she told herself was merely courtesy, and that made the warmth rise in her face all the same. The audience to her life, had there been one, would have seen what she could not. The man was courting his own wife, and did not know how to do it, and she was being courted, and would not believe it, and between them lay a year of careful unspoken things. The dowager saw it, and the seeing alarmed her, and so she sent for reinforcements. She summoned to Wenmore for a long visit the daughter of an old friend, a Lady Marjorie Ashcombe, who was 22 and golden-haired and possessed of £8,000 and a laugh that had been trained in the best drawing-rooms in London. Lady Marjorie was everything the county agreed a duke ought to marry. She arrived in a carriage, with a maid and a mountain of trunks, and she crossed the threshold of Wenmore Hall as though measuring it for curtains, and the dowager presented her to the duke, with the satisfaction of a woman, laying down a winning card. It was a card that did not take the trick, though no one but the duke knew it. Yet he greeted Lady Marjorie with cold civility. He seated her at dinner and answered her sallies in monosyllables and watched down the table the way his wife cut Beatrice's meat into small pieces without being asked. Lady Marjorie, who was not a fool, registered the direction of his attention within 2 days and resolved to correct it. She had been raised to win, and she set herself to the work with the focused charm of a girl who has never been refused. "You must find it all so bewildering," Lady Marjorie said to Edith one afternoon in the morning room, the two of them alone but for the dowager embroidering by the window. She said it kindly, with her head tilted, as one speaks to a child. "The forms of a great house, the expectations. It is a great deal to learn when one comes to it so late, and from such a different sort of life. I do admire how you manage." She smiled. The dowager's needle paused. "Though I confess I should not have the courage to try." Edith set down her teacup. The wound stirred, the old familiar message. You are a governess, and nothing more, dressed now in golden hair and sympathy. She might have let it pass. She had let so much pass. Beatrice, though, was in the room, seated on a low stool with her drawing slate. And Beatrice was listening, and Edith would not have the child learn that a woman must accept being made small. "I find," Edith said quietly, "that a great house is run on kindness and attention, which I learned long before I came here, and which cost nothing, and which no fortune can supply where it is absent." She picked up the teacup again. The dowager's needle did not move. Lady Marjorie's smile held, but something behind it recalculated. What none of them saw was the Duke in the doorway. He had come to fetch Beatrice for a promised walk, and he had stopped as he had stopped once before at a schoolroom door, and he had heard his wife defend not herself, but the dignity of all women made small, and he had watched her pick up her teacup with a hand that did not shake. He said nothing. He took his daughter's hand and walked her out into the gray afternoon. That night, though, he could not sleep, and he stood for a long time at the window of his bedchamber, and he took from the drawer of his writing desk a folded paper he had carried for 13 months and had never been able to open, and he held it, and he put it back. This is the part of the story I most wanted you to reach, so if it has held you, let it. The paper was a letter, and the letter had been written by the first Duchess of Wenmore in the last week of her life, and her husband had not read it, because he believed he had no right. Cassandra had died of a fever, in the autumn following Beatrice's 4th birthday. She had been ill 11 days. The Duke had sat at her bedside through the last of them, and on the 10th day she had asked for paper and ink, and had written something he was not permitted to see, and had given it to her maid, sealed, with the instruction that it be kept until he was ready. He had not been ready. He had taken the sealed letter and locked it in his desk, and he had locked something in himself along with it, because here was the truth the household did not know, and the dowager refused to see. The Duke of Wenmore believed he had failed his wife. He believed that he had been a cold and distant husband, that he had given Cassandra a great house and a great name, and very little of himself, that she had died beside a man who arranged her comfort and never once told her what she was to him. He believed the letter contained her account of that failure. He believed he deserved to read it, and could not bear to. And so for 13 months, he had let it sit in the dark, a verdict he had passed on himself and would not hear pronounced. He had married Edith, he had told himself, to give Beatrice the warmth he could not. He had not understood until he stood at the morning-room door and heard a teacup set down on its saucer by a hand that did not shake, that he had begun to want something for himself, and that the wanting felt like a betrayal of a dead woman he had already failed once. He went back to bed and did not sleep, and in the morning his face was carved stone again, and Edith, passing him in the corridor, thought he had never looked colder, and her heart, the foolish thing, ached for a warmth. She was certain she had imagined. The dowager pressed her advantage through the spring. She arranged for Lady Marjorie to be always present, always charming, always positioned where the Duke must see her against the contrast of his plain wife. She let fall, in company, observations about the importance of a duchess who could do honor to the name in society, about the awkwardness of a mistress who blushed at her own servants, about how the dear late Cassandra had graced a ballroom. And she planned, with the patience of a general, a great spring assembly at Wenmore Hall, the first the house would hold since the late Duchess died, ostensibly to mark the family's return to society, in truth to stage before the entire county the comparison she intended to win. Edith would be made to host it. Lady Marjorie would be made to shine. And somewhere in the evening the dowager intended the difference between the women would become a thing the county could see and would not forget. The night of the assembly came warm and clear in May. Wenmore Hall blazed with light. 300 candles burned in the ballroom, the orchestra tuned beneath the gallery, the terrace doors stood open to the scent of the gardens, and the county arrived in its silks and its diamonds to look at the governess who had made herself a duchess. Edith stood at the head of the room in a gown of pale green the Duke had chosen, and she received them with a composure that cost her everything she had, and she watched Lady Marjorie move through the room in gold and diamonds, laughing, brilliant, exactly what a duchess was supposed to be. The dowager held court near the orchestra with her fan a half-inch too high, and her satisfaction barely concealed. It was the dowager who delivered the third blow, and she delivered it where it would be witnessed by the most people, which was the point. The dancing had begun. The Duke had opened the ball with his wife, stiffly, correctly, his hand at her waist, like a man handling something he feared to break. And then the sets had formed and the room was full of motion, and the dowager, surrounded by a knot of the county's most reliable gossips, said in a voice trained across 40 years to carry exactly as far as she wished, "One does feel for her. A governess cannot help her origins, and my son has been kind past all sense. But blood will tell in the end. It always does. He will tire of the novelty, and then we shall see the house set right." A countess laughed behind her fan. A young matron repeated it to her neighbor. The words moved out across the ballroom in widening rings the way such words do. And they reached Edith where she stood near the terrace doors, and she heard the whole of it, every syllable, with the orchestra playing and 300 candles burning and the county's eyes already turning toward her to see how she would take it. She took it the way she had taken everything. She did not weep. She did not flush, this time because something in her had gone past the body's betrayal into a cold, clear place. She set down the glass she had not drunk from. And then, because she would not give the dowager the satisfaction of watching her break, and because the room had become unbearable, she slipped through the open terrace doors into the dark of the gardens, and she walked until the music was a distant thing and she stood among the roses the late Duchess had planted, and she let herself, finally, be exactly as alone as the world insisted she was. She did not hear him follow. She heard only after a while his voice behind her in the dark. Not a command this time, but something stripped lower than command. "Edith?" It was the first time he had used her name. He had called her Madam and My Dear in company, and nothing at all in private. And now he stood among the roses, and said her given name as though it were a thing he had been holding in his mouth for a year. She turned. The light from the ballroom fell across half his face, and the other half was in shadow, and he was looking at her the way she had told herself she had imagined. "You should go in," she said. "They will miss the host. Let them," he said. He took a step toward her and stopped, his hand half lifted, and did not close the distance, and the not closing was its own kind of touch. "I heard what my mother said. I have heard what she has been saying for a year. I have let it go on because I am a coward, and because I told myself you were too sensible to be wounded by a foolish old woman's grief." He stopped, His jaw worked. "I have told myself a great many convenient things. That I married you for Beatrice, that I feel nothing, that a man who failed one wife has no right to want another." The word want hung in the dark between them. Edith's heart struck once hard against her ribs. "I'm telling you now that I lied," he said, "to you and to myself, and to every soul in that room, and I'm tired of it." Adrian, she said, and his name in her mouth, undid something in his face. She had never used it. She did not know she would. The smallest distance closed between them, his hand finding hers, gloved fingers against gloved fingers, and the warmth of him came through 2 layers of kid skin, like a thing with its own weather, and her body knew, the way it had always known, where he was and what she had refused for a year to let herself feel. They stood at the edge of the light, with the music behind them, and he bent his head, and the kiss, when it came, was soft and full of a promise. Neither of them had spoken, and then he drew back, his forehead against hers, both of them unsteady, because what came next could not be unmade. "There is something I must tell you," he said. "Something I should have told you before I ever asked you to take my name." The telling did not come that night, however, because the dowager had seen the empty doorway and the absent host, and she had set about, with the cold competence of a woman who will not lose, the work of turning the evening to her purpose. By the time Edith returned to the ballroom composed, with the Duke a careful distance behind her, the story had already been arranged. The dowager had let it be understood, in the tender, confiding way of a grieving mother, that the Duke had spoken to her of his regret, that the marriage had been a charitable madness, that arrangements were being considered to settle a competence on the former governess, and quietly restore the family to its proper course. And she had timed her masterstroke for the supper hour, when the county was gathered and seated and attentive, and she rose, glass in hand, and proposed, with every appearance of warmth, a toast to her son's future and to dear Lady Marjorie, whose presence had been such a comfort to the family in its season of trial. The room understood. 300 people understood at once, the way a crowd does, and the understanding moved across the faces in a ripple, and they turned, as one body, to look at Edith. This was the dark moment, and it had been built with great care, and it appeared to close every door. Edith stood at the foot of the table in her pale green gown, with the whole county watching her be discarded, and the dowager smiled at her over the rim of the raised glass, and Lady Marjorie lowered her eyes in becoming modesty, and somewhere a violin was being tuned for the dancing that would resume. And Edith understood that whatever had happened in the garden was about to be drowned beneath the verdict of a room. She did not run. That was the thing the dowager had not accounted for. The governess who blushed at her servants had spent her whole life being made small in rooms exactly like this one, and she had learned, in all those years of swallowing it, exactly how it was done and exactly what it required. And she found, standing at the foot of the table, that she was no longer afraid of it. She set her hand flat on the white cloth. She raised her chin, and in the silence the dowager's toast had created, before the glasses could rise, Edith spoke. Not loudly, but with the clear, carrying steadiness of a woman who has decided to be heard. "You honor my husband," she said to the room, "and I will not let a toast to his future be made on a falsehood. I came to this house a governess. I am not ashamed of it. I taught a grieving child to speak again, and I would do it 1,000 times over, and if the worth of a woman is to be measured by the fortune she brings, then measure me by that child's laughter and find me wanting if you can." She did not look at the dowager. She looked at the county, face by face. "I will not pretend to a station I was not born to. But I will not be toasted out of my own marriage in my own house, by anyone, however dear, who confuses her grief for the dead with a right over the living." The room did not breathe. The dowager's glass had stopped halfway to its height. And into the silence, before anyone could decide what it meant, the Duke of Winmore crossed the floor. He did not hurry. He crossed the length of the ballroom in the measured stride of a man who has finally stopped arranging things, past the orchestra, past Lady Marjorie in her gold, past his mother with her glass arrested in the air, and he came to stand beside his wife at the foot of the table, and he turned to face the room that had come to watch her discarded. He took her hand. He did not let it go. And in the silence that Edith's words had made, into the held breath of 300 people, he said the thing that ended it. "This is my wife. There will be no other." 6 words. They fell into the room and did not echo because there was nothing for them to echo against, only the absolute attention of a county that had come to see one thing and was being shown its opposite. The dowager's glass came down against the table with a small, sharp sound that was very loud in the quiet. Her composure, the architecture of 40 years, did not shatter all at once. It went in pieces. Her hand on the glass, her mouth half open on a protest that found no words, her eyes moving from her son's face to the joined hands and back, searching for the lever she had always been able to find, and finding it gone. Near the orchestra, a dowager countess who had laughed behind her fan an hour before set the fan down in her lap. A young matron who had repeated the cruelty pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. And Lady Marjorie, who was not a fool, understood in a single cold instant that the trick had not taken, that it had never been hers to take, and she gathered the gold of her skirts and her dignity, and inclined her head to the Duke and his wife with a small precise correctness that was, in its way, and she withdrew from the field. The county recognized it. That was the thing the dowager could not survive, not the words themselves but the room's response to them, the visible turning of 300 people from the verdict. They had been handed to the verdict their own eyes now delivered. They had watched the cold Duke of Wenmore, who had buried his heart with his first wife, cross a ballroom to take the hand of a woman in a plain green gown and claim her before them all. And they had watched her stand and speak, with a dignity no fortune teaches, and the county, which is sometimes wiser than its worst voices, knew which of the 2 women in the room was the Duchess. The dowager sat down. She did not leave the table, because leaving would have been a confession, but she sat with her glass empty before her, and her fan motionless in her lap, and she did not speak again that night. And in the not speaking the whole of her defeat was contained. It was the old solicitor of the house, Mr. Harrow, who had drawn up the settlements and known 3 generations of Wenmores, and had been standing near the door through all of it, who stepped forward then and confirmed in his dry, precise voice to anyone near enough to hear that the marriage was sound in law and in every particular, that the Duchess's position was secure beyond any question, and that he had himself witnessed His Grace's instructions on the matter. That very week, it was not a rescue. The Duke had needed no rescue. It was the small procedural seal pressed onto a thing already done, the closing of a door the dowager might otherwise have spent the summer scratching at, and it was enough. The dancing did not resume for a long while. When it did, the Duke danced with his wife, and the county watched, and this time his hand at her waist was not the hand of a man afraid to break a thing, but the hand of a man holding what was his. He told her the rest that night, when the last carriage had gone, and the candles were guttering, and Beatrice was long asleep. He took her to his study, and he opened the drawer, and he laid the folded letter on the desk between them, and he told her what it was and why he had never read it, and what he had believed it would say. "I thought it was her verdict on me," he said. "I thought she had written down everything I failed to be, and I thought that if I read it, I would know I had no right to want anything ever again." He looked at the letter, and not at his wife. "I have wanted you for a year. I have hated myself for it for a year. And tonight I found I would rather read the worst she could say of me than spend one more day letting a sealed paper tell me I am not allowed to live." Edith did not reach for the letter. She reached for his hand. "Then read it," she said, "and I will be here whatever it says." And so the Duke of Wenmore broke the seal. His wife had pressed 13 months before, and he unfolded the paper with hands that were not quite steady. And he read it, and Edith watched his face, ready for grief, ready to hold whatever broke. What she saw instead was the slow collapse of a man set free. Cassandra had not written a verdict. She had written a release. She had known her husband, known the cold, careful way he loved, known that he counted himself a failure for not being a warmer man, and in the last week of her life she had set down, in a fading hand, the one thing she most needed him to hear, which was that she had never once felt unloved. She wrote that she had seen his love in the things he did and not the things he said. In the doctor sent for at the first cough, in the fire built up in her room, in the way he sat through the nights when he thought she slept. She wrote that she forgave him for the words he could not find, because she had never needed them, and that she would not have him spend his life as a monument to her. And then she had written the line that would undo him 13 months too late, and exactly in time. "Do not be alone," she had written. "You were not made to be alone." And Beatrice was not made to be raised by a ghost. When you find someone who makes that child laugh, marry her, and do not let your grief for me steal 1 hour of the life you have left. I release you. I have always loved you. Be happy and let yourself be loved. The Duke set the letter down. He did not weep even then, but his shoulders came down from where they had been held for 13 months, and he looked at his wife across the desk with an expression Edith had never seen on his face, and would spend the rest of her life learning. "She told me to marry the one who made Beatrice laugh," he said very low. "I did not read it. I married you because I could not help it, and I told myself it was for the child. And all the while the answer was sitting in this drawer telling me I was allowed." He laughed once, a broken, disbelieving sound. "I gave you gowns and a name and a great house, because I did not know how to give you the thing I had. She knew. She always knew everything, before I did." Edith came around the desk. She put her hand against his face, the carved stone of it gone soft in the candlelight, and she said the simple, true thing she had not let herself say in a year. "I did not marry you for the gowns," she said. "I married you the day you told me to eat the pheasant, and I was too frightened to know it." And he laughed again, the real laugh this time, the one the county would never have believed him capable of, and he gathered her in, and the folded letter lay open on the desk, between the guttering candles, its work at last complete. If Edith's story has stayed with you, let it sit a moment before you go. They did not have a grand wedding to redo what was already done, but the following winter the household marked the marriage properly, in its own small way, with the people who had earned the right to be there. The snow came early that year, falling soft and steady past the tall windows of the morning room, and a fire burned high in the grate. And Beatrice, 7 now and rarely silent, sat at the pianoforte working through a country air with the fierce concentration of a child who has decided to master a thing. She played the first half well and stumbled on the turn and left the phrase hanging in the warm air, unfinished, and looked up at her father and her stepmother on the settee to see if they had noticed, and they had, and they were smiling. And so she went back to the beginning to try the turn again. On the small table beside the settee, weighted under a smooth gray stone Beatrice had found in the garden and given her father for safekeeping, lay a folded paper grown soft at the creases from being read. Edith had not asked him to put it away. He had not wished to. It sat where they could see it, the first wife's letter that had given the second wife her husband entire, and on the quiet afternoons it caught the firelight at its folded edge and seemed less like a thing left behind than a hand still resting on the house. The dowager came at Christmas and was civil, and then, slowly, across the seasons, something better than civil, because grief that is finally allowed to rest stops needing an enemy, and she had begun that winter to teach Beatrice the card games she had once taught Cassandra. The snow kept falling. Beatrice reached the turn in the music and this time did not stumble. Edith sat with her husband's hand in hers, and the fire warm on her face, and the snow coming down past the glass, and she thought of the gray gown she had worn into this house, and the pale silks she had been measured for against her will, and she understood at last that none of it had ever been the point. He had given his second wife everything a great house could hold. His first wife had left in a drawer, in a sealed and fading hand, the only thing he had not known how to give, and it had waited 13 months in the dark to be opened, and it had brought them all, by its slow, patient mercy, into the same warm room. The letter rested under its gray stone. The music turned and held. Outside, The snow lay clean and deep over the gardens Cassandra had planted, and inside. At last, no one in the house was alone. Thank you for staying to the end of Edith's story. If a moment of it moved you, I would be glad to know which one.